The silence of the village after the second great wave of plague was haunting. Streets that once echoed with the chatter of children, the clatter of wooden carts, and the gossip of women at the well now stood empty, as though time itself had abandoned the place. The stench of sickness still lingered in the air. For those who survived, the world had changed beyond recognition. The peasants who remained were gaunt, hardened, and fearful. Each day was a gamble, not just against hunger and disease, but against despair. For famine had returned yet again. Crops, neglected while the plague swept through, failed in the fields. Rats multiplied, feasting on whatever stores of grain were left, spreading yet more sickness. Families had to make choices no one should ever face: who would eat, and who would go hungry. Mothers gave the last scraps of bread to their children, while fathers went to bed with empty stomachs. And yet, somehow, they endured. Survival was not about comfort but about stubborn will. Peasants turned to the forests and rivers for sustenance. They gathered wild herbs, mushrooms, berries, and roots. Fishing became a lifeline, though even rivers could betray them with sickness or floods. Hunting was often forbidden by law. The Lord's game was not for peasants to touch, but desperate men risked whipping, imprisonment, or even death just to catch a rabbit for their families. In this world, the social order was as rigid as the walls of a castle. The lords remained at the top, their halls filled with warmth and food, their feasts glowing with candles and wine. Below them, peasants toiled endlessly. But the plague had cracked something in this order. For the first time in generations, there were fewer peasants than before, and that meant labor was scarce. Lords who once demanded obedience found themselves needing to bargain. Fields left untended could not feed anyone, and without peasants, even the mightiest manor could fall into ruin. Some peasants seized this chance. With fewer workers, their hands became more valuable. Men and women began to demand higher wages, better rights, or at least lighter burdens. Of course, lords did not always agree. Laws like the Statute of Labourers in England tried to freeze wages and bind peasants back to the land. But the spark of resistance had been lit. A whisper spread among the survivors: maybe life did not always have to be as it was. Still, resistance came at a price. In villages across Europe, those who spoke too boldly could find themselves punished, whipped, or even executed. The church, too, weighed heavily upon the peasants' souls. Priests preached that the plague was God's punishment for sin, and only repentance and obedience could save them. To many, this felt like salt in an open wound. How could a mother believe she was guilty of divine sin when her children starved before her? And yet, the church held power not just in heaven, but on earth. Its rituals brought comfort, and its priests often held the only records of life and death. In the dark of the night, some peasants turned to older beliefs. In secret, they whispered prayers not only to the Christian God but to ancient spirits of the fields and forests. Charms were hung on doors, herbs burned to ward off sickness. A simple coin, blessed in holy water, was carried like a shield against the unseen terrors of the world. Faith, whether in God, saints, or nature, was the thread that stitched their fragile lives together. The rhythm of peasant life still followed the seasons. Spring meant back-breaking labor in the fields, summer meant long days under a blazing sun, autumn brought the harvest, and winter was always the cruelest test. In winter, the days were short, the nights long, and food the scarcest. Families huddled in their huts, smoke filling the rafters as they burned whatever wood they could gather. The howling of wolves outside reminded them how close death always was. Inside those huts, life was simple and harsh. A single room might house a family of 6 or 7. Straw on the floor served as bedding. A hearth of stone, smoky and uneven, was the only source of warmth. Meals were usually a thin pottage, a watery stew of grains, beans, and whatever vegetables could be spared. Meat was rare. On feast days, a salted herring or a scrap of pork might be shared among many. To modern eyes, it would seem like endless misery, but for peasants, this was life, and life was precious no matter how hard. Community was their only strength. Villagers relied on each other as much as they relied on the land. When a neighbor fell sick, others helped tend the fields. When a house burned down, the village rebuilt it together. This sense of solidarity was their armor against the cruelty of the world. But even solidarity had its limits. In times of famine, suspicion grew. Rumors spread of witches poisoning wells, or strangers carrying the plague. Fear could tear a community apart as quickly as hunger could. The plague itself never truly vanished. It came in waves, striking when least expected. A cough, a swelling, a sudden fever, and within days, another family would be gone. The sight of plague carts, piled with bodies and dragged through the muddy streets, became burned into memory. Children grew up not with toys but with the sound of funeral bells. And yet, even in such darkness, there were moments of resilience. Festivals, though fewer and simpler, still brought joy. On holy days, peasants gathered, sang songs, danced in circles, and drank ale brewed from barley. Music and storytelling became their escape. Around fires, old tales of heroes and saints reminded them that courage could be found even in despair. These stories were their inheritance, passed from one generation to the next, carrying hope across centuries. The medieval peasant's survival was never guaranteed, but it was always defiant. To endure plague, famine, and the rule of lords was to carry an unbreakable spirit. Their lives were marked by hardship, but also by a quiet strength that history too often forgets. They were the backbone of the Middle Ages, nameless, faceless in chronicles, but very real in their suffering and their courage. And as the 14th century gave way to the 15th, whispers of change grew louder. The world was shifting, slowly, painfully. The peasants who had survived plague and famine were no longer the same as before. They had seen death, defied it, and learned that even the lowest in society could hold power, if only they dared to seize it. The dawn of another century did not bring ease to the peasants. The land was still scarred by famine, the scars of plague still raw, and the lords still demanded their due. But something within the hearts of the survivors had changed. They had seen whole villages vanish in silence, watched their neighbors carried away in carts, buried under hurried heaps of earth. And through that silence, they had discovered a truth more powerful than their hunger. Life, though fragile, was theirs to fight for. The lords believed the old order could be restored, that peasants would bow their heads as they always had. But across Europe, something restless stirred in the fields. The survivors of plague realized their labor was no longer cheap. Entire villages lay empty, and yet the castles still needed their bread, their wine, their wool. Those who toiled had become indispensable. And when the lords tried to chain them down again with laws, punishments, and sermons from the pulpit, anger began to smolder in the mud cottages and smoky taverns. At first, it showed itself in whispers. A peasant refusing to work another man's land without pay. A widow demanding rights to her late husband's fields. A group of villagers walking away from their manor to find a kinder lord. These were small acts of defiance, almost invisible to the chronicles of history. But to those who lived them, they were sparks in the dark. The church continued to preach patience, humility, and fear of eternal damnation. Priests told the starving that heaven would reward their suffering, that obedience was the path to salvation. But when bellies are empty, sermons lose their weight. And when the plague returned again and again, cutting down the righteous and the sinful alike, many began to question whether the heavens listened at all. Some turned bitter, convinced that God had abandoned them. Others turned to wandering preachers who promised new visions of justice, a world where lords and peasants would stand equal before God. By the mid-14th and 15th centuries, small revolts broke out. Bands of peasants, tired of their oppression, rose up against their lords. Some seized weapons, others refused to pay rents or taxes. Castles were burned, manors stormed, and records of feudal debts destroyed in flames. Most of these revolts were crushed swiftly and brutally, with blood staining the fields where wheat should have grown. But every rebellion left an echo. The lords had been reminded that the peasants were not faceless beasts of burden, but people with voices and rage. And through all of this, survival continued. Fields still needed sowing, children still cried for food, winter still came biting at the doors. Families worked together with unyielding determination. Women, often overlooked in chronicles, carried as much weight as men. They labored in fields, tended to livestock, baked bread, brewed ale, and nursed the sick. They kept households alive even when fathers and sons perished from war or plague. To ignore their role would be to erase half the story of survival. The diets of peasants remained humble. Bread was life itself, dark, coarse loaves baked from barley, rye, or oats. Pottage, a thin stew of vegetables, beans, and grains, filled their bowls daily. Meat was scarce, but when it came, perhaps a pig fattened all year, slaughtered before winter, or a salted herring bought at market, it was a feast that lifted spirits for days. Ale, brewed week and consumed daily, was safer than much of the water and gave strength to tired bodies. In the simplest of meals lay the endurance of generations. Festivals still carried them through despair. May Day brought dancing around poles, laughter in the fields, and the rare chance to forget hunger. Harvest festivals celebrated survival itself, with singing, storytelling, and the drinking of whatever ale could be spared. On these days, peasants felt, however briefly, the dignity of being human, not just laborers bound to the soil. The harsh winters never relented. Children shivered under straw blankets, families huddled by small fires that filled their homes with smoke. Wolves prowled closer in desperate years, and many nights were filled with the eerie cries of hunger both outside and within. Yet there was beauty even in this struggle. The stars above the medieval countryside shone brighter than any candle, and in the stillness of night, peasants whispered prayers of hope, not always to lords or priests, but to something greater, unseen, yet deeply felt. Plague remained a shadow that haunted their steps. It would return unexpectedly, carried by fleas on rats or travelers on the road. Villages would fall silent once more, bells tolling endlessly. But with each return, those who survived learned better how to endure. Some isolated themselves in the woods, some fled to the hills, and others simply accepted fate, continuing their labor until death itself took them. Survival was not guaranteed, but courage in the face of death became a way of life. Generations passed in this cycle of suffering and resilience. And yet, slowly, change took root. Markets grew, towns expanded, and the rigid chains of feudalism began to crack. Peasants who once knew nothing beyond their village now traveled to nearby towns, selling their produce, buying goods, and glimpsing new freedoms. Children of peasants sometimes became craftsmen, apprentices, or merchants. The boundaries between lord and serf blurred, ever so slightly. The spirit of survival turned into something greater, the spirit of transformation. The memory of famine, plague, and cruelty remained, but so too did the memory of resistance. The world of the peasants was no longer simply about enduring, it was about carving a place for themselves in history. Even in their poverty, they had kept stories alive. Stories of hardship, yes, but also of laughter around hearth fires, of love in times of despair, of children born and raised despite the odds. These stories, passed from mouth to mouth, carried the dignity of lives that kings and lords would never record in their chronicles. They were the true memory of the Middle Ages, not the castles or crowns, but the endurance of the countless souls who refused to vanish into the dirt. By the time the medieval world gave way to the early modern age, the peasants had already shaped history in ways unseen. Their struggles had weakened feudal bonds, their labor had built nations, their survival had made possible every change that followed. Though nameless in most records, their fingerprints remain on the very foundations of Europe. And so, when we ask how medieval peasants survived plagues, famine, and lords, the answer is not simple. They survived with empty bellies but unyielding hearts. They survived with faith, even when faith seemed broken. They survived with hands scarred from labor, backs bent from toil, but spirits that refused to break. They were not just victims of their time. They were the quiet heroes of an age that history calls dark, but which was illuminated by their resilience. Every loaf of bread baked, every field sown after devastation, every child carried through sickness was an act of defiance against a cruel world. And through that defiance,